The early winter cold in Chicago seeped into every seam of her clothing, settling like a thin layer of frost over everything, refusing to melt, refusing to ease, clinging instead to her skin and her thoughts. It was 10 o'clock at night, yet inside the Lexington the light still glowed warm and golden, the air thick with people, with the scent of hot butter, scorched garlic, red wine, and expensive perfume. The atmosphere felt heavy, as if it couldn't quite shake off the mixture of elegance and exhaustion. Sweat slid silently beneath the tight black shirt clinging to the body of the server, blending with the cheap perfume she wore and the hidden fatigue she carried. Rachel Monroe had been on her feet for 11 straight hours, her steps repeating like a program written into her bones as she navigated the crowded dining room where people laughed, ordered, toasted, and pretended to care about one another. She moved with the rhythm of someone who had trained herself to read a customer's needs before they knew how to voice them. Her lower back throbbed, her calves burned, and the practiced smile she had worn for nearly 3 years in this job was beginning to crack at the corners. But she could not slow down. Not tonight. Not when her tips would decide whether she could pay her rent or spend one more week dreading the angry knock of her landlord and the unanswered phone calls that followed. The main dining room of the Lexington buzzed with the same Friday night energy as always. Men loosened their ties after business deals that might not be as clean as they appeared. Couples gazed at each other across candlelight, trying to reclaim feelings time had already carried away. Tourists took pictures of their meals as if they were landmarks. Rachel slipped through all of it, a silver tray balanced effortlessly on one hand, her steps steady, her words exact, her expression friendly enough but never too familiar. She had learned how to be invisible, as any good server must present in the moment a need appeared, but gone fast enough to protect a customer's privacy. Perhaps that was why she noticed him immediately. Table 19, tucked in the far corner behind a wooden divider that shielded it from the main dining room, the table reserved for those willing to pay extra for discretion. Julian Roth. She had served him 3 times in the past 2 months. Always the same, arriving at 9 o'clock sharp, always alone, except for the bodyguard seated at the next table, ordering a medium rare ribeye and a glass of Cabernet Sauvignon, leaving a tip of exactly 20%, never raising his voice, never summoning a server with a snap of his fingers, never causing a scene. Yet every employee understood that Julian Roth's table required the precision of a surgical procedure, because on the rare occasions when someone brought the wrong wine or interrupted him during a moment of quiet thought, they were not fired, but their schedule changed, their section reassigned. As if some invisible hand rearranged their shifts without a word of explanation, Rachel had learned not to ask questions about men like Julian Roth. In a city like Chicago, where the most powerful families were tied to things no one wanted to name aloud, survival meant lowering your eyes and keeping your observations locked inside. She knew he was important, in the kind of way that never appeared on a tax form. Knew the slight drag at the end of his sentences hinted at the East Coast, a place where secrets never die, they only sleep. Knew the custom suit he wore cost more than her combined earnings for half a year, and tonight, she knew something was different. If you are still listening and feel this story touching something inside you, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, to like and share this video, so we can continue bringing heartfelt stories every day. And if it isn't too much to ask, would you tell me where you're watching from? Leave a comment below and let us know which corner of the world this story has reached. We treasure every word you share with us. The first time Rachel ever served Julian Roth had been a night in the middle of October, when the wind turned sharp and the bare branches cast long shadows across the stone sidewalk outside the Lexington. He stepped in at 5 minutes to 9, just as he had tonight, neither loud nor drawing attention, yet his presence alone seemed to compress the air around him. The glass door closed behind him, shutting out the wind, and every gaze in the VIP section paused for just a single beat. Julian was not handsome in the usual way. His face carried a classic sharpness, angular, with deep, dark eyes not cold, but piercing enough to make a person feel seen in ways that stripped away their defenses. He was tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the precision of someone who calculated each step before taking it, wasting no motion. No one introduced him to Rachel, no one needed to. Men like Julian did not require names to be recognized. He sat at table 19, unfolded the white silk napkin across his lap, and did not look at the menu. Rachel approached with a water tray, following protocol, though her heartbeat had been noticeably quicker that night. "Good evening. Would you prefer still or sparkling water?" The familiar question left her lips in the same calm tone she always used, though she felt the faint tightening in her shoulders. Julian lifted his head, and for a brief moment his eyes met hers. Still, no ice. His voice was low, warm, not stretched like a southerner's, not clipped like someone from the north, but softened in a way that made her lean in slightly without meaning to. She turned to pour the water, noting the order he conveyed without ever speaking it. Medium rare ribeye, no sauce, extra roasted vegetables, a glass of the most expensive Cabernet Sauvignon on the list. It all took less than a minute. No wasted words, no unusual requests. But Rachel felt she had just stepped into a space without signposts. In the visits that followed, Julian arrived at the same time, ordered the same meal, and always had the same man seated a table away, a large, quiet figure dressed plainly enough to disappear into the background. Tony, someone Rachel had never seen look away from the room for more than 3 seconds. Julian never once asked for Rachel by name. But on his second visit, when she approached his table, he said, "You were the server that night." Not a question, a statement. She nodded, instinctively smoothing her hair, and immediately resented herself for doing so. "Good. You work very professionally." That was all. No smile, no polite flourish. Yet his words lingered with her the entire night, a small flame in the cold. After each of Julian's visits, Rachel tried to treat him like every other customer. But she knew she was watching him more closely than she should. She noticed the way he cut his steak, as though each motion carried weight, the way he tilted his wineglass so the light skimmed the surface before he tasted it, the way his eyes swept the room before returning to center, mapping exits and people with quiet efficiency. Julian spoke very little, but every word had purpose. And Rachel sensed something she could not allow herself to articulate. This man did not come here only for dinner. Something existed beneath the cashmere, beneath the polished Italian shoes. A layer of silence thick as ice, hiding something far larger than fine meals or expensive wine. Julian was the kind of man who made others believe he needed no protection, and yet he had Tony. And for Rachel, that was the first piece of the puzzle that made her pay more attention than she should. He was not warm, not approachable. But in a world as noisy and artificial as the Lexington on any given night, his silence held a power she could not ignore. And then, as always, he finished his meal, left the exact tip, stood, and vanished into the Chicago night as if he had never been there. Yet his presence never truly left the room. And deep in her instincts, Rachel knew one day she would have to choose between being silent like him or breaking that silence. The 4th time Julian Roth appeared at the Lexington, the cold was so sharp that a thick white film of frost clung to the restaurant's glass doors like a sheet of fogged paper. Outside was wind and snow. Inside was the warm glow of yellow light and the soft clink of silverware against porcelain. Rachel knew he would come, as always, at exactly 9 o'clock. And at exactly that moment, Julian walked in, his charcoal gray overcoat draped over him, leather gloves on his hands, moving straight toward table 19, as if the entire room were no more than a backdrop. Tony followed like a shadow, carrying the same calm, quiet demeanor. But tonight, only 5 minutes in, Rachel realized something was wrong. Not with Julian, but with Tony. The man she once believed could stand still as stone, for an entire evening kept sliding his hand into the inside pocket of his coat and pulling it out without retrieving anything. By the 3rd time, she could no longer pretend it was a thoughtless habit. She passed their table the 1st time to refill water, the 2nd time to check the candle, the 3rd time to deliver the entree. Each pass was justifiable, brief enough to remain unnoticed, yet long enough for her to watch. Tony was no longer holding the posture of a man on guard. His shoulders drew inward, his leg bounced with an uneven rhythm. When Julian said something, Tony merely nodded without meeting his eyes, his jaw clenching, the muscles shifting as if he were grinding his teeth. The longer she watched, the more certain she felt that this was not simply a bad night for the bodyguard. She had been in the service industry too long not to recognize when someone was hiding something. There were gestures only those who lived behind. The curtain of hospitality could read the way Tony checked his watch no fewer than 3 times, within less than 10 minutes, each glance lingering longer than necessary, as if counting down. Julian was unchanged, cutting his steak with those smooth, precise movements, eating at the same measured pace, not hurried, not relaxed. He revealed no sign that he noticed anything unusual happening within arm's reach, but Rachel noticed, and the feeling clung to her like snow stuck in the treads of her shoes, cold and unmoving. She wondered whether she should say something to the manager, but then remembered the quiet reshuffling of staff schedules every time someone made even the smallest mistake with Table 19. No one ever said anything aloud, but everyone understood. This was not a man to be disturbed, and Rachel, though every instinct screamed a warning, chose silence and kept watching, until she saw Tony take a secret call. He did not lift the phone to his ear, only glanced down at the screen beneath the table before snapping it shut. She could see his thumb moving quickly over the screen as if typing. Not an innocent message, not from this man. An hour later, when Julian requested another glass of wine, Rachel approached with her usual composure, but her mind spun with scattered details. The bodyguard shifted his chair to get a clear view of the back door, kept checking his watch, avoided eye contact, typed hurriedly on his phone. And something about Julian's complete unawareness made her even more uneasy. If a man like him did not notice, then either he was choosing not to, or he was being kept in the dark. Both possibilities were dangerous, and Rachel, who had no significance in this world, found herself fearing for a man who had never spoken her name, yet lingered in her thoughts in ways she could not explain. She stood behind the service counter, her hand resting on the water pitcher while her eyes stayed fixed on the shadowed corner where Table 19 sat. The scattered details were no longer scattered. They began linking themselves into something that tightened her stomach. Tony was no longer the immovable wall she once believed him to be. He was doing something else, something that did not belong to a loyal protector. She saw him glance at his watch again, quick and sharp, as if counting each minute. Then a stranger appeared. Coming from the direction of the men's restroom, a middle-aged man emerged so ordinary that no one would have a reason to look twice. His hair was short, thinning a bit, and he wore a wool coat far too heavy for the temperature inside the restaurant. He did not look around, did not acknowledge the menu or the candlelight. He simply walked toward the table where Tony sat, saying nothing. Rachel was carrying dessert to table 4 when she saw it. The stranger's hand slipped into his coat pocket and pulled out a pale yellow envelope, thin and precisely folded. No logo, no writing, nothing that would draw attention in a post office. But here, in this moment, it could not be ordinary. Tony was not surprised. He leaned slightly forward, accepting the envelope in one fluid motion, no hesitation. The gesture was too practiced to be accidental. The envelope disappeared into the inside pocket of his vest beneath his coat, so fast that if Rachel had not looked at exactly the right second, she would have missed it. The stranger did not linger, did not speak, only turned and walked toward the bar, where the dim light swallowed his face into shadow. Rachel stood frozen for a few seconds, her breath heavy. She tried telling herself it might be personal papers or confidential work documents, anything harmless. But something in the smoothness of that exchange made it impossible to believe her own reassurance. In a city like Chicago, where everything could be a mask, the smallest details were often the loudest confessions. And Tony had just received something not meant for daylight. When she returned to Julian's section, his second glass of Cabernet was already more than halfway gone. He still sat upright, his expression calm as he focused on the flavor of the medium-rare steak. But Rachel no longer looked at him the way she once did. She looked at him the way someone might look at a beautiful painting hanging on a wall that could fall at any moment if the nail gave out. She could not be certain her interpretation was correct, but she had lived long enough to know there were signs a person simply could not ignore. Like the way Tony now kept his hand close to his inner pocket, no longer resting both hands on the table the way he used to. Like the way his eyes drifted toward the entrance, then to the back door where staff moved in and out, as if every doorway was either an exit or a threat. Rachel had never imagined she would find herself in a moment like this. She was just a server trying to collect enough tip money to pay bills and save for a steadier life. She did not belong to a world where envelopes changed hands in the shadows or glances carried layers of meaning. But tonight, somehow, she had stepped into that world. And if she was right, if that envelope was the beginning of something worse, then the man sitting only a few steps away might be the one being placed on the board. The problem was, he had no idea. And she, whether she wanted it or not, now held a piece of the truth no one else had seen, and it was burning through her from the inside. Rachel stood behind the service counter, her hand trembling slightly as she opened the drawer to take out more dessert menus. but her mind was spiraling into a vortex with no way out. The envelope. The way Tony accepted it without even looking. The quick flick of his eyes toward the back door as if he were timing something, waiting for an event to unfold according to schedule. And Julian, still calmly cutting the last piece of steak on his plate, seemingly unaware that a betrayal was taking place right beside him. Rachel tried to take a deep breath, but the air inside the restaurant suddenly felt thick, as if every voice, every clink of dishes, even the soft strands of jazz were being crushed into a single oppressive weight. She had learned to ignore things that did not concern her, had chosen silence as a means of survival, in a world where silence was sometimes the only thing that kept a person safe. But tonight, something inside her urged her to break that rule. Her heart pounded so violently it felt ready to burst, and her instinct screamed that if she did nothing, something would happen. Something terrible. Something that could not be undone. She pulled the small order notebook from her apron pocket and took the pen clipped to the counter's edge. The first slip of paper was torn hastily, filled with shaky, incoherent sentences that read like the rambling of someone losing control. She crumpled it and shoved it aside, grabbing another. The second attempt was shorter, but too vague. Be careful, something is wrong. Reading it back, she knew Julian would never react to a warning so frail. He was the kind of man who responded to evidence or to a fist hitting the table, not to a whisper. She tore off another piece. This time, she set the pen down and wrote with all the clarity she could muster. Your bodyguard received an envelope from a stranger. You are the target tonight. Do not use the back door. Sharp, clear. No rambling. She read it twice, found no mistakes, no wasted words. Her hand still trembled, but the letters were bold and unmistakable. She folded the paper into quarters and slipped it into the leather check holder. The room around her continued moving as if nothing had changed. Couples laughed and raised their glasses. A group at table 8 snapped photos of their food. But to Rachel, every sound felt warped, every movement slowed. She walked toward table 19, each heartbeat heavy as a hammer. Julian looked up when she approached, his expression composed. I can bring your check if you're ready, she said, her voice steady and professional, so controlled it startled even her. Julian nodded. All right. She set the check holder down beside his water glass, just as she always did. But inside, it held more than a bill. It held a note that might change the course of an entire night. As she turned away, she caught Tony's gaze for half a second. She offered a polite smile, but her palms were slick with sweat. She walked back to the counter, refusing to look over her shoulder. She had no way of knowing what Julian would do. She did not know whether he would believe her. But she did know one thing. If she stayed silent and something terrible happened, she would never forgive herself. Behind her, the soft sound of paper unfolding broke through the air like a quiet exhale, and the entire world seemed to hold still with Rachel, waiting for what would come next. Rachel stood behind the counter, pretending to polish a wine glass, though her eyes never left table 19. Julian rose to his feet, not hurried, not abrupt, not in any way that would attract attention. He simply stood as though he had finished his meal and was ready to leave. Rachel held her breath. If he went out the front door, everything remained within a safer margin, though it would draw attention. But if he moved toward the back, the direction Tony kept glancing at. Julian stepped forward 2 paces, then suddenly turned left, toward the double doors leading into the kitchen. Rachel's heart stopped. No. She wanted to shout, but her throat closed. The passage through the kitchen led directly to the alley behind the restaurant, the very place she believed a trap waited. She had written clearly not to use the back door. Why would he walk straight into it? But as Julian's hand pushed open the swinging door, Rachel realized something. He was not heading toward the emergency exit that led to the alley. He veered sharply, toward the service freight elevator. The narrow passage used only by staff to transport supplies to the basement garage. A hidden route so easily overlooked that even inattentive bodyguards rarely noticed it. Julian was not walking into the trap. He was slipping beneath it. Tony's head jerked upward. In that instant, his cold eyes tracked Julian's movement. And for the first time that night, Rachel saw raw panic flash across his face. He knew the freight elevator. He knew that if Julian made it to the basement, where his armored car waited, the entire ambush planned for the alley would collapse. Tony leapt to his feet, the chair scraping loudly enough that several customers turned their heads. His calm facade shattered. He called out, his voice cracking with strain. "Sir, that is not the exit." But Julian did not look back. His shadow disappeared through the kitchen doors, decisive and cool. The doors swung and closed behind him with a soft, deadly finality. Tony did not waste a second. He launched forward like a predator released from its cage, his right hand plunging beneath his vest, ignoring the startled glances around him. He knew he had lost the element of surprise. Rachel froze behind the counter, gripping the dish towel so tightly her fingers blanched. She saw Tony's eyes flick toward the service station for the briefest moment, before he stormed into the kitchen, a look filled with suspicion and violence. She had interfered with their game, and now the king had slipped out of checkmate. Tony moved from the table like an animal sensing danger in the air. No more ease, no more composed posture. He crossed the room in quick strides, his right hand sliding into his coat where Rachel was certain he hid something that had no place in a restaurant. No one in the dining room sensed anything unusual. A few guests glanced over due to the loud scrape of the chair, then returned to their wine and conversations. But Rachel saw everything. She saw Tony's walk shift into a restrained run, his attempt to appear calm failing as he closed the distance to the door Julian had passed through. Instinctively, she turned her head toward the swinging doors. They were still moving slightly, not fully closed. But Julian was gone. She did not know what he was doing, whether someone was waiting for him inside, or whether he had a plan to counter this betrayal. All she knew was that Tony had read something in Julian's movement, and he was unraveling. Tony slipped through the doors and vanished into the staff area. Rachel saw him pull out his phone, his fingers racing across the screen, as if triggering a chain of actions prepared long before tonight. The air in the dining room shifted again. Not because anyone spoke, but because, at the edge of her vision, near the right corner of the restaurant, another man was moving, a server she had never seen before. White shirt, black tie, the same uniform as the staff, but the clothes did not fit. The collar was skewed, and the shoes were not the kind required by the Lexington. Rachel was certain he did not work here. He left the bar area with a too natural stride, carrying an empty wine tray, but his eyes betrayed him. They were locked onto a purpose. He moved toward the hallway leading to the back door, the same direction as Tony, at the same moment, but seeing Tony's frantic sprint, the man hesitated. The fake server, realizing the trap had failed, blended back into the shadows and fled. Rachel began to shake. She felt it now. She had stumbled into something far bigger than she could have imagined. This was no longer just a bodyguard's betrayal or a warning scribbled on a slip of paper. This was a plan, coordinated, with multiple players, and Julian, unless prepared, would be walking straight into their trap. She wanted to call someone. But whom? The police. They would take at least 10 minutes to arrive, if they believed her at all. The management? They did not even know who Julian truly was. She could chase after them, but to do what? Stop Tony? Confront the fake server? She had no weapon, no plan. And most importantly, she did not know if she would survive if she pushed deeper into this. But she could not stand still, not after writing that message, not after Julian had trusted her enough to act on it. She left the counter and walked quickly toward the kitchen, stopping 3 steps from the double doors. Through the narrow gap between them, she saw nothing. No strange noises, no shouting, no panic, only silence, thick as night. And then, from somewhere inside, she heard the soft metallic clatter of something hitting the floor, small but sharp enough to stop her heart. Rachel pressed her back against the wall, her fingers tightening around the edge of her apron, her mind spinning. She did not know what was happening beyond those doors, but she knew one thing: the plan had fallen apart, and now, everything was about to change. She strained her ears for even the smallest sound. There were no gunshots, no shouting, only a strange, prolonged silence that made her skin prickle. After a moment, the doors swung open, but it wasn't Julian who stepped out. It was Rick, one of the assistant cooks. His face looked a shade too pale, his eyes flicking behind him before landing on Rachel as though he couldn't fully register her presence. He walked quickly, saying nothing, greeting no one, disappearing within seconds down the corridor toward the staff storage area. Rachel understood then that something had happened inside the kitchen, and Rick wanted no part of it. She turned, moving quickly toward the locker room, every step pressing into the cold ground beneath her shoes. Her shift had ended more than 20 minutes ago, yet no one stopped her or asked questions. The entire restaurant seemed paralyzed by a tension only the perceptive could feel. She removed her apron, unpinned her name tag, folded her shoulder towel, and placed everything neatly into her locker. Her hands were still trembling, her heart not yet returning to a normal rhythm. She put on her wool coat, wrapped her scarf tightly, and slipped out the back door. Snow drifted down in thin, ash-like flakes. The parking lot behind the restaurant was nearly empty, only a few lonely cars scattered across the dark pavement. Rachel crossed the brick courtyard, her boots leaving faint imprints on the fresh snow. She had not brought her car, as usual. Her apartment was about 6 blocks away, and she often walked home to save every last dollar she could. But tonight, every step felt heavier. The wind slipped beneath her collar and through the layers of her scarf, carrying a damp chill that felt like someone brushing their fingers across her skin. She quickened her pace, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed ahead, though she could not stop herself from glancing over her shoulder now and then. At first, there was nothing. But by the time she turned onto the 3rd block, the sensation had settled in her bones. Someone was following her. Not clear footsteps, not a voice, not even a definite movement. Just the unmistakable feeling of eyes pressed against the back of her neck, tracking her, memorizing every motion. She paused, pretending to adjust her scarf. She cast a discreet glance behind her, but the street was empty, except for a weak street lamp and a parked car. She resumed walking, this time faster. The unease didn't fade, it sharpened, as though every footstep she made left a mark someone else was tracing. When she turned into the narrow alley behind her apartment building, her heart pounded. The light here had been out for a week, and tonight the darkness felt like a curtain, heavy enough to swallow anything whole. She hurried, her shoes scraping along the concrete, stopping only when she reached the iron door leading to the shared hallway. As she slid the key into the lock, she heard a faint sound behind her, like a shoe sliding lightly over snow. Without thinking, she spun around. The alley was still pitch dark. No one stood there, but the lid of a large trash bin near the corner trembled slightly, as if something had brushed against it. Rachel didn't wait to find out what. She unlocked the door, darted inside, slammed it shut, and slid the bolt across. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her breath short and frantic as though she had sprinted. She stayed pressed against the cold metal door for several long seconds, listening. No footsteps, no knock. But the feeling stayed, unbroken, so vivid it couldn't possibly be imagined. Someone had followed her, and that someone knew exactly who she was. It took nearly 15 minutes before Rachel had calmed enough to move away from the entrance. She turned on every light in her small apartment, closed the curtains tightly, checked the door locks 3 times before allowing herself a full breath. She removed her coat and her scarf, but kept her shoes on. Her feet were freezing, but she couldn't bring herself to look away from the phone on the table. No missed calls, no messages, nothing from Julian, nothing from the restaurant. The silence was unnerving, a silence that pressed against her skull. She boiled water, poured herself a cup of tea, her hand still unsteady around the mug. The faint scent of mint rose into the air, but did nothing to soothe the turmoil spinning through her mind. Who had followed her? Was it Tony, the fake server? Or someone else, someone she hadn't even noticed yet? The questions knotted in her chest with no answers. Then her phone rang. The piercing sound cut through the quiet, jolting her so hard she nearly dropped the mug. She grabbed the phone. An unfamiliar number flashed on the screen. No name. Her hand hesitated for a beat before she accepted the call and lifted it to her ear. Rachel Monroe? The voice was a woman's, low, steady, neither rushed nor warm. "Who is this?" Rachel asked, trying for calm but unable to hide the edge in her voice. "My name is Olivia. I work with Julian Roth." The words struck her like a blow. She tightened her grip on the phone. "Is he all right?" A long silence, almost the length of a heartbeat, passed before Olivia answered, "For now." The way she said it made "for now" sound more terrifying than any threat. "So, why are you calling me?" Rachel asked, her voice dropping lower. "Julian read your note, and because of it, he avoided a trap." Olivia spoke with deliberate clarity, each word carefully measured. "We know you're not with them. But you've stepped into this now, and you need to make a choice." Rachel's pulse hammered. "A choice about what?" Olivia didn't answer right away. Another slow, heavy silence filled the line before she continued. I want to meet you. Not over the phone, not in public. We need to be certain you're not being followed, not compromised, and more importantly, we need to talk about why Tony betrayed him. Rachel stood frozen in the middle of her living room. She wasn't an agent. She wasn't police. She was a server, a woman who happened to notice something wrong and was brave or foolish enough to act. Yet here she was, standing at the threshold of two worlds. One was the simple, fragile life she had been scraping together. The other was the world of people like Julian, people who lived in the shadows, where every decision carried consequences. I don't know if I can help any further, Rachel said softly, though something deep inside her already knew she had crossed that line. I'll send the address, Olivia replied quickly. Tomorrow night, 8 o'clock. Come alone, tell no one. The call ended before Rachel could say another word. The screen dimmed. Her apartment fell silent again. Inside her, fear tangled with curiosity, reason tangled with something deeper, a thin, invisible thread pulling her forward. She knew she was no longer a spectator in this story, and tomorrow night, everything would change. The following evening, exactly at 8 o'clock, Rachel stood before the small coffee shop on a quiet corner, its faded wooden sign hanging loosely overhead, and a handwritten notice on the glass door, smudged from age and weather. Inside, there were almost no customers, only the scratchy hum of old jazz drifting from a speaker near the counter and a warm amber light spilling onto the worn wooden floor. She pushed the door open, the bell chiming softly above her, and that single sound seemed to lift her out of the world outside. Julian was seated at the back table, his back initially turned to the entrance, but the moment she stepped in, he lifted his head as though sensing her presence even before the bell rang. He wore a black sweater under a gray wool coat, his face composed as always, but his eyes were different this time, recognizing something, gauging something, and beneath all of it, something that resembled gratitude. Rachel walked over and sat across from him without waiting for an invitation. Her hands wove together in her lap, her palms cold and damp. Julian studied her for several seconds before he spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying no hostility but possessing a quiet gravity that demanded attention. Thank you for the warning. She gave a small nod, trying to hide the tension in her posture, her face. I wasn't sure I was doing the right thing, she said softly, barely above a whisper. If you hadn't believed me, or if I was wrong, I could have made things worse for you. But I am alive, Julian replied calmly, which means you were right. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. What did you see? Rachel swallowed. Tony received an envelope from a stranger. He was acting oddly the moment he entered the restaurant, checking his watch over and over, avoiding eye contact with you, watching the doors constantly. And then, another man, pretending to be a server, moved the same time you stood up to leave. I don't know exactly what they were planning, but something was very wrong. Julian did not answer immediately. He continued watching her, assessing not only her words but the sincerity in her eyes, the truth in her posture, the subtle tremor of her hands. You do not seem like someone who gets involved in things like this, he said. Rachel let out a small, humorless laugh. Trust me, I never imagined I would ever slip a warning note into the check of someone like you. Julian leaned back in his seat, fingers interlaced atop the table. I have worked with Tony for nearly 8 years. No one has ever been closer to me than he has. And that is exactly why this is almost impossible for me to accept. He did not just betray me. He sold me out. Julian paused, his gaze drifting briefly to the steam rising from his coffee. You do not need to look over your shoulder for him. Tony has been removed from the equation permanently. Rachel held his gaze. Why? He was silent a long moment, as if weighing how much to say. Then finally he spoke. There is a group that wants to take my place. Not with violence, not the way movies portray it, but by removing me quietly. An accident, a disappearance, a replacement from within. Tony was the perfect link in their plan. He met her eyes again, and this time his gaze sharpened. And you somehow disrupted all of it. Rachel did not know whether to feel proud or terrified. She stared at her hands before raising her head. So what now? I'm already pulled into this, aren't I? Julian nodded once. Yes, but you still have a choice. You can walk out of here tonight, go back to your job, and we will make sure no one touches you. Or you can step further in, learn what it takes to survive in this world, and be protected permanently. But in exchange, there is no path back." Rachel exhaled a soft, strangled laugh. "I am just a girl who pours water in a restaurant, and now I'm sitting in a cafe with a man who can make someone disappear with a single phone call." Julian did not smile. His voice lowered to a near whisper. "And you saved that man." His eyes did not waver. "So the question is, who do you want to be now? The girl who pours water, or the woman who chooses the next chapter of her own life?" Rachel did not answer immediately. She glanced toward the rain-fogged window, where snow had begun to fall again. Soft white flakes drifting through a deserted street like something out of a dream she never expected to enter. She knew that whatever she chose, nothing would remain the same. Julian turned from the window, the streetlight casting a faint glow along his cheekbone, and Rachel noticed the fine lines near his eyes. Lines not from age but from too many nights without sleep. He sat quietly for several seconds, as though deciding something deeply personal, then placed one hand on the table and pulled a small, dark wooden box from inside his coat, setting it gently between them. Rachel looked at it, not touching, not questioning, waiting for his words. Julian's voice was lower than before, but no longer distant. "In the world I live in, there are not many people who hold on to clarity and decency in the midst of danger. You not only saw what was wrong, you acted to stop it. You saved me from a death that was planned with care, Rachel. And that is not something I intend to forget." She glanced at the box before looking back at him. "What's inside?" Julian did not answer right away. Instead, he opened the lid slowly, revealing a simple silver pendant etched with unfamiliar markings. It did not glitter or boast the brilliance of expensive jewelry. Instead, it carried a weight that felt almost ancient. "This is a symbol of protection," he said. "It is not decoration. In my world, when you wear this, every enemy, every ally, every rival, understands that you are under my protection, and that means they are forbidden from touching you." Rachel stared at the small object lying quietly between them. No one had ever told her about a world where power could be carried on a string around one's neck, but here it was. She gave a shaky laugh, unsure whether from nerves or the surreal feeling of being inside a story she never agreed to join. "I think you're joking." Julian's expression did not change. "I have never joked about survival, and neither should you." Rachel reached out, brushing her fingertip over the cool, smooth surface, like stone beneath snow. "If I accept this, it means I'm agreeing to step into your world." Julian nodded. "Yes, no one wears this and returns to ordinary life, but I will not force your hand. This is a choice. You entered by accident. If you stay, it is because you choose to." Rachel straightened, placing her hands on her thighs, her gaze steady on him. "Why me? You have hundreds, maybe thousands of people who would work for you, protect you, even die for you. Why choose an anonymous waitress?" Julian leaned back, his gaze deep, unwavering. "Because you are not afraid." "I am afraid," she shot back instantly. "I was shaking. I ran out of the restaurant like a criminal. But you came back," he said softly. "You answered the call. You walked in here. You are asking the questions others are too afraid to ask. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing to move despite it. You are the kind of person I need." Rachel went still. No one had ever spoken to her that way. No one had ever looked at her and seen anything other than a server who smiled on cue and carried trays. But Julian saw something else. And that, she realized, was the most dangerous part. He pushed the box toward her. "The decision is yours, but I do not have much time. If you step in, I will teach you everything you need to survive. If not, you will leave this city tonight, and I will ensure no one ever knows you existed. Both are forms of protection, but one keeps you alive. The other makes you disappear." Rachel stared at the pendant again, her chest tightening with a feeling she could not name. It felt like she had been standing at the edge of the road for too long, and now a gate had swung open before her. She did not know what waited beyond it. Only that if she refused to walk through it, she would wonder for the rest of her life what might have happened if she had been brave enough to take the step. Rachel held the necklace in her hand, her fingers closing around it, as if trying to feel the true weight of the decision she had just made. The pendant no longer felt cold, or perhaps her hand had grown too warm beneath the flood of emotions rushing through her to distinguish the difference. Julian said nothing more, watching quietly as if this moment no longer belonged to him. She lifted the chain, slipped it over her head, and let the pendant settle against her skin beneath the thin layer of her sweater. The instant it touched her, she felt a distinct chill sweep across her neck, glide down her spine, then spread through her entire body. It did not hurt. It was not frightening. It was simply a shiver she could not explain, as if a thin veil of mist had passed through her mind for a brief second before dissolving, leaving behind a calm that felt strangely less lonely. Julian nodded slowly, as though he had witnessed this ritual 100 times before. She had chosen, and the world would respond. Rachel did not fully understand what he meant until they stepped out of the cafe. Everything appeared the same: the deserted street, the falling snow, the dimmed glow of the streetlights, but the man sitting in the parked car nearby watched her with the recognition reserved for someone significant. It was not curiosity, it was acknowledgement. He gave a slight nod when their eyes met before looking away. At the corner, a woman in a black coat walked her dog, and when she glanced at Julian and Rachel, she subtly pressed 2 fingers against her left wrist in a silent signal, before continuing on as if nothing unusual had happened. Rachel slowed her steps, her eyes sweeping the quiet street. Anyone who saw them was playing a part. It was too smooth, too synchronized, too deliberate. She turned to Julian. "They already know, don't they?" Julian gave a faint smile. "This world has its own language, Rachel. And you just spoke a vow. People will recognize it and adjust accordingly. You are no longer invisible." Rachel drew a long breath, letting the icy air fill her lungs. For the first time in years, she felt seen not by customers or co-workers, but by people who lived between shadow and light, people who shaped destinies without ever appearing in the news. They knew her, and more importantly, they acknowledged her. When she returned to her apartment, Rachel stood before the mirror, removed her coat, and revealed the silver pendant shimmering against her skin. Small and simple, and yet now it looked like an etched mark of fate. Everything had changed. She had changed. And the world would no longer look at her as a waitress. The next morning, Rachel woke earlier than usual, though she had barely slept. The necklace still lay at her throat, cold and light as if it had always belonged there. She studied herself in the mirror, searching for any visible sign that her life had shifted, but the reflection was still the same. Rachel with tousled brown hair, shadowed eyes, and delicate features. She put on her coat and scarf, stepped outside, and walked into a city that bustled as though it had no idea she had done something that would alter the course of her life. But she could feel it, a pressure on her shoulders like a garment made of something unseen. Eyes no longer glanced past her. They lingered with caution, with curiosity, sometimes with subtle wariness. At the bus stop, she noticed 2 police officers scanning the crowd, their expressions hard and authoritative. One of them locked eyes with her, and for a second, Rachel felt the old instinct to look away. But as the officer's gaze dropped to the silver pendant resting against her throat, his demeanor shifted instantly. He didn't ask for ID. He didn't question her. Instead, he straightened his posture, touched the brim of his cap in a sharp, subtle nod of respect, and deliberately turned his back to give her privacy. It was a gesture of deference from the law itself. Later, she walked past a nightclub that had just closed for the morning cleaning. 3 large men with tattoos on their necks and scars on their knuckles stood by the entrance, the kind of men Rachel would usually cross the street to avoid. One of them stepped forward as if to block her path, a leering grin on his face. Then he saw it, the faint glint of silver. He froze mid-step. A silent signal seemed to pass through the group. The grin vanished, replaced by a look of sudden, cold recognition. Without a word, they stepped aside, clearing a wide path for her on the sidewalk, their heads lowered as she passed. Rachel walked through the space they created, her heart pounding not from fear, but from the realization of what she now carried. She was no longer just Rachel. She was untouchable. She was stepping into a world where gestures, glances, and distance carried layered meaning, and every action she made was being observed through a different lens, one where no one spoke, yet everyone understood their place. She returned home, shut the door, and wondered what exactly she had entered. She had thought Julian's protection might feel comforting, but instead it marked her with a symbol that set her apart from everyone around her. Her phone vibrated. A new message from an unsaved number. "You will adjust. Do not take it off." Rachel stared at the words, a chill brushing her spine. Though no name appeared, she knew it was Olivia. She set the phone down, walked to the window, and pulled aside the curtain. A black SUV sat at the mouth of the alley, engine off, lights off, unmoving like a pair of eyes hidden behind tinted glass. She knew they were watching. It was inevitable. Julian would not let her walk alone through the first days of her initiation. Whether it was protection or surveillance, the effect was the same. She was no longer entirely free. She leaned back against the wall, her fingers rising to the pendant. No one had told her that the price of being seen was not admiration but separation. And now she understood. When the world recognized her, she could no longer disappear into it, and the weight of that truth was heavier than anything she had imagined. That evening, Rachel received a brief message from Olivia. 8 o'clock, rooftop of the Whitmore Hotel. No explanation, no instructions. Just a place and a time, and in this new world, a few words often carried more weight than an entire conversation. She dressed in a simple black dress, slipped on her long wool coat, let her hair fall naturally, and stepped out with a mix of anticipation, worry, and sharpened awareness. The Whitmore Hotel sat in the Gold Coast, its marble walls and thick red carpets, a quiet statement that not everyone was allowed inside. But when she entered, no one stopped her. The receptionist gave a small nod and guided her to a private elevator. It ascended straight to the top floor, where the doors opened to a silent hallway draped in velvet and lit by crystal chandeliers casting soft, shimmering reflections on the ceiling. A man in a black suit waited at the end, and without asking her name, inclined his head and held the door. Inside was a glass-walled dining room with a sweeping view of the city glowing beneath the night sky. A table was set with candles flickering gently, and deep red wine glistening in tall, thin glasses. Julian stood by the window, his back to her, and only turned when the door clicked shut. "Rachel," she nodded in greeting. He moved toward her, lacking the hard edge he often carried. In his light gray suit, he seemed deliberately softened, as though easing the invisible distance that had always lingered between them. "Thank you for coming." She sat when he gestured. They shared the first course in silence, accompanied only by the quiet murmur of classic jazz drifting from hidden speakers. The tension between them felt delicate, not from danger but from the weight of something important waiting to be said. After the waiter refilled their glasses and retreated, Julian finally spoke. "You have survived the first 3 days since wearing the necklace. I know it has not been comfortable." Rachel lowered her glass. "It feels like being seen through. People do not look at me like a normal person anymore. They avoid me. They fear me." Julian shook his head gently. "They do not fear you. They fear the one standing behind you. And that is the only thing keeping you safe." She held his gaze, expecting something more than that truth. Julian exhaled. "I did not invite you tonight just for dinner. I want you to consider a formal role. Not protection, not a subordinate, a liaison, someone who can stand between both worlds. You have the instinct to sense danger before it arrives, the intelligence to remain silent when needed, and the courage to act when others freeze. People like you are rare. And I do not want you to survive this world merely by wearing a symbol. I want you to have purpose within it." Rachel tightened her hold on the napkin in her lap, her eyes drifting toward the glittering city below, where thousands of stories played out each night, unnoticed by most. She had never been trusted with anything meaningful, never invited into any space of consequence, but she also knew that accepting meant there would be no return to who she had been. "If I agree," she asked quietly, "what happens?" "Next," Julian poured a little more wine into her glass. "You will be trained. Someone will teach you to read a room, to move without leaving a trace, to survive when everything around you begins to break. And if you excel, you will earn the right to choose your own path. You will not be a piece on the board. You will be a player." Rachel watched the red liquid swirling, catching the warm gold of the candles like diluted blood. It was not romance. It was warning. Every step in this world demanded a price. But what made her nod was not power. It was the way Julian looked at her when he said she mattered. For the first time, someone saw her not as a shadow, and for that she was willing to risk everything. Rachel sat silently before the half-finished glass of wine, her mind spinning with a tangle of questions that offered no answers. Julian did not press her, because he understood that what he had just proposed was not something a person could swallow in an instant, especially not a woman who less than a week earlier had been a waitress in a restaurant no one remembered, a woman whose life had never brushed anywhere near the edges of power. but her silence was not refusal. It was the quiet before a turning point. Rachel lifted her gaze and met his eyes. If I agree, I need to know what I am walking into. I will not step forward blind. I will not become a tool again. Her voice carried a steadiness that was neither fragile nor doubtful but belonged to someone testing the true boundaries of the opportunity laid before her. Julian nodded, his eyes softening in a way he rarely allowed. You will not be a tool. I do not need obedience. I need someone who can choose, someone who sees what others overlook. You will not be forced into anything, but once you accept, you carry the weight of every decision. No one will come save you when you make a mistake. No one will protect you if you lose yourself. Rachel lowered her head, not out of fear, but because those words touched something inside her that had long been neglected. For years she had lived by schedules, by orders, by pre-written menus. No one had ever asked what she thought. No one had ever let her decide the shape of her own life. For the first time, she had a choice, but a choice always carried consequences that would follow her for the rest of her days. I have one condition, she said quietly. Julian raised a brow, not surprised but not expecting it so soon. If I work with you, I want the truth. Not the pieces I need for a task, the whole truth. About you, about Olivia, about the power I am standing too close to. If I am stepping into a dangerous game, then I want to see the entire board. Julian did not respond at once. He studied her for a long moment, then inclined his head. You are not like anyone I have ever worked with, and that is why I chose you. He lifted his glass and tapped it lightly against hers, a small gesture that felt like an unspoken agreement. Rachel took a sip, her heart tightening with a storm of emotions. She knew she was stepping away from everything familiar. No more early mornings making coffee, no more clatter of silverware in the kitchen, no more strained smiles from regular customers as they left a few dollars on the table. She was entering a world where every glance carried meaning, every word hid a deeper layer, and every mistake demanded a price far greater than time or money. But she also knew that if she walked away now, she would remain suspended between existence and invisibility forever, and she was exhausted from pretending that invisibility was enough. Julian straightened, the sharpness returning to his eyes, but without the earlier distance. Tomorrow night Olivia will come for you. From then on, nothing will be theoretical. Rachel nodded, feeling a weight inside her that was not fear but a deep awareness that every step ahead would now carry the full consequence of choice. She rose, looking at Julian one last time before turning away. The pendant brushed against her chest, a wordless reminder of the path she had chosen, and the world would answer. The next morning, exactly at 7, the doorbell rang 3 short times and 1 long. Rachel had been awake long before, sitting in the dim of her small kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee. When she opened the door, Olivia stood there wearing a charcoal trench coat, her face expressionless, her gaze sweeping over Rachel as if measuring her resolve with a single look. "Are you ready?" Rachel nodded without speaking. They descended to the black SUV waiting on the street, and no one spoke during the half-hour drive through Chicago's quiet dawn streets. The car stopped in front of a building with no sign, only a concrete structure wrapped in dark glass, giving nothing away. Olivia swiped a key card, and they passed through 3 layers of security before stopping in a small room lit by soft recessed lighting, a smooth wooden table between 2 chairs, and a thick envelope placed neatly in the center. Rachel sat when Olivia gestured. She opened the envelope and pulled out 2 identical copies of a contract. The language was not long, but each line was sharp, clear, and stripped of emotion. No promises, no seduction of status. Only clauses about absolute confidentiality, personal accountability, and the acceptance of any consequence born from her own actions. Rachel read every word slowly. Her hand did not shake, but her heartbeat grew louder with each sentence. When she finished, she signed with a steady stroke. Olivia collected the papers and handed Rachel a small black box. Inside was a slim, unbranded phone with a blank screen and a single power button. "This is internal communication. No GPS, no hacking, no stored numbers, no internet. All contact starts from us. Keep it with you at all times." Rachel lifted the device, surprised by how light it felt, though it carried the coldness of newly cut metal. Olivia continued, her voice even, controlled. From today, you begin a 6-week training cycle. Each day starts at 6 in the morning and ends at 8 at night. No personal phone, no social media, no outside communication. If you quit midway, your information disappears, and you leave the city that same night. Rachel did not flinch. She simply nodded, as if she had expected every word. Olivia rose and opened the door. A middle-aged man stood waiting, dressed entirely in black, his movements fluid like a former soldier. He did not give a name, only nodded once. "Come with me." Rachel stepped out of the room, leaving behind the contract, the cold coffee still lingering in her thoughts, and the life that had officially ended. She did not look back, because from the moment she signed, every exit behind her had closed. Only one path remained, forward. The first day of training began before the sun rose. Rachel awoke to 3 sharp knocks echoing through the small basement room she had been assigned. No windows, one narrow bed, a metal locker, fluorescent lighting, and a camera fixed high in the corner. Marcus, as she would later learn his name, stood waiting in the hallway. He said nothing, simply turned and walked. She followed him through a carpeted corridor, through a steel door unlocked by code, and into what looked like a miniature military compound. Concrete walls, rubber-padded floors, and an array of simulation sets. A fake bar, a hotel lobby, an elevator, a public restroom. Every scene built with eerie accuracy, each corner hiding its own test. Marcus did not lecture or ease her in. He tossed her a gray training uniform and said one word: begin. The first segment was physical conditioning. They ran 5 laps around the training floor without pauses. Then push-ups, sit-ups, rope climbs, and obstacle courses. Rachel was not weak, but she was not built for this. Her muscles screamed after the 3rd lap, her legs trembling, sweat streaming down her back. Each time she slowed, Marcus did not reprimand or encourage. He simply watched with that same questioning gaze, silently asking whether she meant what she had agreed to. She gritted her teeth and kept going. After the physical trial, she was brought into another room where a table and a large screen awaited. Files, photographs, diagrams, coded messages were spread across the table. Marcus spoke only once. Analyze like a predator. Do not read. See. For 3 hours, she was dropped into scenario after scenario. Track a person through a sequence of security photos, spot the anomaly in a camera map, detect false emotion in a typed message. She had thought working in a restaurant had sharpened her observation skills, but now she understood this world demanded a completely different kind of sight. She had to look as if her life depended on noticing a blurred corner in a video frame. She was given a 15-minute break midday. No lounge, no chair, just a wall to lean against and a bottle of water. Rachel did not complain. She drank quietly and reorganized her thoughts. The afternoon was devoted to reflex training. Marcus led her into a room with sensor-sensitive walls. Lights flicked on and off without warning, alarms shrieked, hidden doors snapped open. She had to react instantly. Duck, run, freeze. She failed repeatedly. Sometimes she tripped. Sometimes she reacted late, and the red alarm howled through the room. But she did not quit. Every error sharpened her instincts. By the time she returned to her assigned room that night, her body felt like it had been taken apart and rebuilt badly, her arms twitching from exhaustion, the soles of her feet burning. But her eyes no longer held confusion. They held quiet determination, the beginning understanding that she might be more capable than she had ever believed. When she lay down, the cold pendant touched her sternum, whispering a familiar reminder that she was no longer standing outside the door. She had stepped through, and no matter how punishing the path ahead might be, she knew she was ready to learn how to own it. By the 4th week of training, Rachel stepped into the reflex room without feeling the frantic heartbeat that used to pound in her chest during the early days. The moment the lights snapped on, she moved into position instinctively, her eyes sweeping across all 4 corners of the ceiling in a habit carved deep into her body. When the alarm sounded and the door on the right burst open, a mannequin lunged toward her. Rachel dropped low, pivoted her shoulder, slipped past the impact, and struck the precise weak point marked in red on its chest. A sharp beep echoed from the control panel. Perfect. Marcus stood in the corner of the room, arms crossed, giving her a slight nod without offering praise. Rachel didn't need praise anymore. Success had become the new baseline, Not luck or coincidence, but the hard-earned result of every hour spent sweating, stumbling, rising again, and letting pain carve strength into her bones. She remembered her first day, when finishing 3 laps around the track felt like punishment. Now her mornings began with 10 laps, and she still had enough strength to complete everything that followed. She no longer asked, "Can I do this?" That question had died on the 5th day, when she stopped checking the clock to measure her suffering. It was replaced by something sharper. "Can I do it faster, more precisely?" In the analysis room, she was no longer overwhelmed by dozens of surveillance photos, blurry security footage, or coded messages. Her eyes now caught details others overlooked. Her ears picked up suspicious patterns buried in repetition. Her instincts reacted quicker than her thoughts. Olivia, who occasionally visited to monitor progress, once stood behind her without Rachel noticing. But moments later, as Olivia walked away without a sound, Rachel turned her head and said quietly, "You're wearing soft soles, but the collar of your coat brushes against your belt. There's a faint scrape each time you turn." Olivia had only smiled, said nothing, but Rachel knew she had just passed an unspoken test. Confidence began to settle in her, not pride, but the grounded understanding of where her limits were and how to push them outward inch by inch. In the simulation drills, she was no longer the hesitant newcomer reacting late, waiting for direction. She anticipated, she decided, and she was right most of the time. No one in the facility said it out loud, but their eyes said enough. Suspicion had faded into acknowledgement. Observation had shifted into respect. Even Marcus, once relentless in correcting every minor mistake, now sometimes let her run an entire drill without interference. It was recognition without words. That night, lying on the narrow metal bed she had grown accustomed to, Rachel no longer felt the weight pressing against her chest like in those early nights. She stared at the white ceiling, her hand resting against the necklace, beneath her shirt, feeling the steady pulse of her own heartbeat. She wasn't afraid anymore, not because the world had become less dangerous, but because she had changed. She could now walk through darkness without trembling. She could see the truth behind another's eyes. She could predict danger from the smallest shift in the air. Rachel was no longer the quiet waitress hiding behind a kitchen door. She was becoming someone new, someone forged in the very world she once feared, and someone who no longer stepped back. The final week of training didn't begin with physical drills or emergency simulations, but with an invitation from Olivia to attend a private cocktail gathering in a penthouse downtown. The first time Rachel would face the real world she was being prepared for. She was given a simple, yet perfectly tailored black dress and a pair of heels that felt foreign compared to the soft, soled work shoes she once wore. Olivia did not accompany her. Rachel was dropped off in front of the building, where a driver opened the door for her without speaking a word. The top floor unfolded into a breathtakingly elegant space with high ceilings, warm amber lighting, and the soft hum of jazz that wrapped the air like velvet. The guests were impeccably dressed, polite, measured in every movement, yet each handshake carried an invisible force. Rachel felt like a current beneath her feet. This was not a party. It was an arena. And everyone here knew the rules. Rachel moved exactly as she had been taught, holding her glass the right way, letting her gaze settle without wavering, offering a smile that was part courtesy, part curiosity. The first person to approach her was an older woman with silver hair pinned neatly back, her voice low and commanding. She didn't give her name. She simply asked, "Julian chose you, didn't he?" Rachel nodded once. That alone seemed to give the woman everything she needed before she drifted away without another word. What followed was a series of short, polite conversations, each carrying a subtle test behind the calm expressions of the speakers. They asked her thoughts on neutrality in business, whether she believed loyalty existed in a world where information was currency, and if she had to choose between morality and survival, which she would choose. Rachel didn't answer correctly. She answered truthfully. "I think no one can keep their hands clean if they want to survive in a system that's been dirty from the beginning, but I would choose the kind of dirty I can control." Some looked at her longer than was polite, as if surprised a newcomer would dare speak so plainly. After 2 hours, Rachel understood the real test wasn't about elegance or charm. It was about steadiness. They wanted to see if she could hold her ground, whether she cracked under pressure, whether she flinched. She didn't. She began to understand the silent language of the room, the way someone dabbed their lips before mentioning something truly important, the way eyes drifted away when a lie was spoken, the alliances suggested by who stood beside whom, and who avoided clinking glasses together. Everything was a code, and she was learning fast. When the evening wound down, Julian appeared not dramatically, not with flair, but simply walked in, and the air shifted around him. He approached her with only one quiet instruction: "Come with me." They left the penthouse, descended to the garage where a black car waited. On the drive back, Julian said, "You didn't just keep up. You made an impression. Someone even asked if you're being groomed for an advisory role." Rachel gazed out the window, watching the streetlights flicker like thin slices of her old life fading behind her. She didn't reply, but her hand found the necklace resting against her chest, reminding her she was no longer moving out of fear. She was moving because, for the first time, the path ahead belonged to her. No one would ever look at her with pity again. She was not a pawn. She was learning how to play the board. Standing alone on the highest floor of the building, looking down at a city glowing in warm golden light, Rachel crossed her arms, her hair stirring in the crisp, biting winter wind. Below her, the streets wove together like restless veins, each car's headlights blinking like the heartbeat of a living giant she had now become part of. From a quiet girl carrying trays through a forgettable diner during the brutal Chicago winter, she had stepped into a world where every word carried hidden weight, where a handshake could sustain a life or end one. That world was colder, more intricate than anything she had imagined, but it was also where she learned to define herself for the first time. She had once been afraid of being left behind, unseen, forgotten, a name that drifted through life without leaving a mark. But now she understood that a life worth remembering didn't come from where one stood. It came from how one stayed standing when the storm hit. Rachel touched the pendant resting against her chest. Since the day she put it on, everything had changed, not because it offered protection, but because it symbolized choice. She hadn't been forced into this life. She had walked into it. And with every step, she learned to see the world through the eyes of someone who no longer feared its shadows. Maybe all of us have been a Rachel at some point, living quietly in someone else's shadow, hoping to be seen, drifting through a life we didn't choose. But the real question is, when opportunity appears, do we dare take it, even knowing the road ahead won't be easy, even knowing there may be no way back? Rachel's story isn't just about survival. It is a question of identity. Who am I without someone else telling me where to go? Who am I when I alone choose right from wrong? Who am I in a world where trust is a luxury? And what about you? After hearing her story, have you ever felt yourself standing at a threshold the way Rachel did? Have you faced a moment where you had to choose between safety and growth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We would be honored to hear what resonates with you, from the deepest part of your heart. Every story reflects a piece of life, and through your own voice, we might find the connection that busy days often steal from us. If this story touched something inside you, please remember to like the video, share it with someone you care about, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any of the touching, meaningful stories we bring to you each day. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. We wish you good health, peaceful days, and a life filled with gentle, positive light. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.